just to get a baseline for where everyone is, how many of you watched the 507 video clip? Did you get a chance to see it? Okay, great. And then how many of you were able to read the 5 pages of Aoshi's interrogation transcripts? Ooh, great. Okay, so I don't need to go into a lot of background. That is the Wing Luke Asian Museum, and I'll just say that Aoshi was my grandmother, and she was the immigrant voice in my life, raising my younger brother and myself. And I thought it would be kind of fun. Why don't you guys get out a writing utensil, a pencil or pen. I thought it would be fun and relevant to try and get in the mindset of a person immigrating to the U.S. And there's 7 types of questions that are in the RAISE Act that was proposed in August 2017. And I thought it would be interesting to see what is our eligibility for coming to the U.S. with that act. Okay? So you get points. You have to have a minimum of 30 points to be considered for immigration to the U.S. if that act gets approved. So question 1, how old are you? Assign yourself the number of points based on your age. I get 0. I'm over the hill. Question 2, what's your highest level of education? And you could do what it is now, if it's high school, is 1 point, or you can do it for what you expect when you graduate. Bachelor's, 6 points, etc.
So if you have a master's in something that's not STEM, they don't care.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah? Yeah. Good question. Question 3, what's your English ability? Assign your points. The actual act would give a real test. Question 4, do you have a job offer? And the actual act would take 150% of median salary for that year. This Time magazine article took the median salary of 2014. So, this is an interesting thing. How many of you, when you graduate, expect to get an offer salary over $77,000 a year? That's so great. You're optimistic because that's what it would take to get any points.
How much is that in per hour?
Oh, I don't know. So 77,000 divided by 2080 is a typical number of hours in a work year. What would that be? You can see the math.
Pretty high.
Yeah.
30.
If you, I'm going to keep
about
going.
like $35 or $37 per hour.
37 an hour. Okay.
Do you know about
You get 25 points if you have a Nobel Prize. You get 15 points if you won an Olympic medal in the last 8 years. And if you have, I want your autograph. Question 7, this is the last question. Do you plan on investing any money in the U.S. in a commercial enterprise? If you are, can you write a check for over $1.35 million? Because that's what it would take to get any points. Okay, add up your points. How many people would be eligible to immigrate? You've got 1 out of 12.
But I'm not. I think I'm the only one who's an international student. So.
Yeah. So it really matters, right?
Right,
Yeah.
You should get really working on that.
Yeah. So we.
Yeah, Nobel Prize too, right?
Yeah, that's
Well, and that is interesting. If you look, 40% of the points come from Nobel Prize and Olympic medals. Interesting, right? If it's a maximum of 100. Okay, so this all leads to the concept that Professor Hart talked about, and I had mentioned when he came in on October 10th, he talked about this concept of otherizing. And I thought, wow, this is really applicable right now. And I found applicability to my life. When he talked about the moral community, do you remember that? As a classroom, we have an agreement on how we would treat each other. So if I go out to get a drink of water, you wouldn't rifle through my backpack and take my wallet or take my laptop. That's an agreement that we have amongst each other. Otherizing would be, we have this agreement, but then we say, oh, a person or a group of people, they're outside our community. And so we can treat them like others. Or we can treat them less than us or even dehumanize them. And that concept applied to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The Exclusion Act of 1882 otherized Chinese laborers, and it said if you are Chinese and in the US, you cannot be a citizen, which meant that some states were able to apply what they called alien land laws. You can only buy, rent, lease property if you are an American citizen. So there's this catch-22, because if you were Chinese in the Chinese Exclusion Act era, you couldn't become a citizen. The act was supposed to last 10 years, lasted 60. So how did my grandfather get in? And I didn't know. Family folklore, all kinds of rumors. I found his Chinese Exclusion Act files also. First I found my grandmother's, then I found his. So it turns out he came over February 19th, 1903 during the Chinese Exclusion Act era. And the way he came in was as a merchant. So he found a way to not be in that otherized community of laborer. He was a merchant with a $1,000 investment in a company called the Huachang Company. And what I find interesting is that $1,000 in 1903 dollars is worth $25,000 today. So he would miss the mark given that criteria. That was just, you know, if he wanted to invest, he'd have to have over 1.35 million. So I know one of the course objectives is to understand how does Seattle relate to immigrants at the time. I found this video, Seattle's Waterways to the World, and I took a 2-minute clip that was an interview of David Williams and Jennifer Ott, who were the co-authors of a book called Waterway, the Story of Seattle's Locks and Ship Canal. And it gives a relationship between David Denny and how people in Seattle related to Chinese labor. So let's just watch this clip really quick.
So another decade or so passes. In the 1880s, David Denny, Thomas Burke, and others form what's known as the Lake Washington Improvement Company. The build cuts between Lake Washington and Lake Union and Salmon Bay, big enough for some logs, because David Denny had a mill in Lake Union. They hire a company run by a man named J.J. Cummings, and one of the interesting things about Cummings is he says explicitly in his contract is that he will not hire any Chinese. In the 1880s in Seattle and through much of the West Coast, there was this very horrible racism against Chinese. And so he was, you know, clearly getting out in front of the anti-Chinese movement. Cummings starts work on the project, cutting a route from Lake Union to Lake Washington. And after a month or two, Cummings runs into much harder soil than he expected.
They found, as any gardener in Seattle often finds, that as soon as you dig a little bit, you hit the hard pan, and it's impossible to dig. It is like rock. And so Cummings tried to get more money in order to justify the harder work and the longer time that it would take. And the Lake Washington Improvement Company did not want to pay that, and they had an alternative. They could reach out to labor contractors in Pioneer Square. One of the prominent ones was the Huachang Company, which was started by Chung Ching-Hak. Chinese immigrants were willing to work very, very hard for not very much money because they did not have a lot of choices. So the first successful connection made between the lakes and the Sound was completed by the Chinese laborers. But just as they're finishing that work in the fall of 1885, you have anti-Chinese movements gaining steam, and a number of the white residents of the city did not want Chinese people to be here. It was very violent. They forced them out to a dock and told them they had to leave. And it's ironic that just as the city is growing and just as we need them for projects like the Ship Canal, we're forcing them out of the city.
So that clip was really interesting to me because Professor Hart also talked about the canal. Do you remember he said that when the canal officially opened, it drained the rivers, and the settlers sat up on the banks and watched the native people die because the rivers had been drained, their food source was gone. And so for me, that was like this terrible idea of otherizing, that the settlers could watch people dying and not help them. So how was otherizing executed against Chinese and people of Asia? Well, when the Chinese Exclusion Act extended for 60 years, there were several other immigration acts that were added, and one of them was the Immigration Act of 1917. And it involved banning countries in this whole area called the Asiatic Barred Zone. And you can see from the criteria that is listed, it's just I picked a few of them. This is what they thought of people coming from those areas, that they're idiots or imbeciles, suffering attacks of insanity, health, polygamists, prostitutes, and if they did speak English, a literacy test that they had to take, similar to the English test of the 2017. And what I thought was interesting is Aoshi's questions, when you read those 5 pages, did you get the sense of, they did a medical examination, they said that. She had suffered from hookworm. I definitely felt they were trying to get at, is there a first wife, is she still alive? Does your brother have multiple wives? You know, they were looking for the polygamy piece of it. And I thought what was interesting with the oral history from the Norwegian community, do you remember there was a sister who brought over her sisters, but would not bring her brothers because she said they were worried that the brothers would leave a wife and family behind, come here and start a new family. So I thought, oh, that's interesting because I don't know that they were questioned when they came over for the polygamy aspect as well. And then for Aoshi, they did suspect she was a concubine, which means one of many wives. I'm not sure if they also suspected that perhaps she was a prostitute, but their questions were, I think, very specific towards this kind of criteria. And then I wanted to just point out this visual. So this is a visual of Angel Island, which was a different point of entry down in San Francisco. And you'll see these men in uniform questioning this person, and I imagine Aoshi being there, can't speak any English, so everything's being translated back and forth, and you saw that in the video, the audio tape of the questioning. And then there would be a stenographer who's typing everything, so I just think how intimidating that would be. So why come with all of that? And I never got a chance to ask my grandfather. He died 10 years before I was born. And I never asked my grandmother because it was just something we did not talk about. You knew as a family, if we started to get down that path, there would be, you know, you could tell how the conversation would change. So what I imagine is, at the time, in 1903, there was war going on in China. The Boxer Rebellion, the British were fighting, famine. And I'm thinking they probably were leaving a bad situation. And if any of you have an opportunity to ask your relatives, ancestors, anybody, it's information that would be lost. If you're comfortable, I would encourage you to ask, how did they come, why did they come? And I think in Aoshi and Art Wing's life, they were hoping to find new opportunities and reach the American dream. And I love this picture because Art Wing came in 1903. This is 2 years later. Look at the hair, the parting on the side, the white collared shirt. You can see up close, it's a flowered tie. I was like, wow, he's pretty dapper in a wool suit. They're trying to look as an American as possible. The thing that I find, though, is they can't change the color of their skin. And that impacted the way that the Chinese Exclusion Act was then repealed. So the Exclusion Act was repealed for political reasons. In 1941, the country of Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in the US. And so Warren G. Magnuson, who also is from Seattle, he was a US Senator representing Washington State, proposed the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So it was repealed so that China would align with the US and not with Japan. That was the political purpose. But there was a little bait and switch. It was a little bit of a repeal and a replace kind of situation because they assigned then, instead of the Exclusion Act barring Chinese laborers, they now put a Chinese quota in place, 105 Chinese, and it's based on ethnicity. So even if a person had never been to China and never held Chinese nationality, they still counted toward the 105 quota. So in their case, in Art Wing and Aoshi, let's say that they were born and raised in the UK, and their papers said they were born and raised in the UK, and they came to America. they wouldn't have counted toward the 65,000 people who were allowed to come from the UK. They would have counted toward the 105 because it was their ethnicity. So it goes back to that idea of otherizing, that we're seen as our ethnicity, our heritage, our race, our skin color. Something that I find is interesting about otherizing as well is I think that there is a component of fear, because Professor Hart talked about the natives were portrayed as dangerous, right? So that the moral community could say, oh, we're afraid of them. And when I was thinking about it, I had talked about in the 507 video how the Chinese were vilified, so that the moral community, if you've never met a Chinese person, this is what you think of them. By the same token, the people who are otherized are also fearful. So you see Art Wing and Ao Shi, they look nothing like this. But Ao Shi, when I was growing up, she was afraid of the police. And I know this from her actions. She never said the words to me. When I was young growing up in Chinatown, and we're walking around, anytime we saw a policeman or a police car, she would say to me, "Lokicha," which meant police. And she'd say, "Lai shu kokai," hold my hand, we're crossing the street. "Mokong," don't speak. "Hangamoy mokong," did you hear me? Don't say a word. And we would cross the street and take a circuitous route to our destination to avoid crossing the path of any police. So this is how I grew up. By 1967, I-5 cut a swath right through Chinatown, and with it, it brought outsiders. So by the time I was in 3rd grade, I'm walking to Bailey Gatzard Elementary School from Chinatown, and along with the other kids. And then all of a sudden this man jumps out from behind a pillar and opens up his coat and does this dance. He's naked underneath. And I'm 9 years old in 3rd grade, so I'm like, "What's your name?" And he's like, "Johnson." So the neighborhood kids knew him as Johnson. And this is in the springtime, and over the spring, he gets more and more bold. He starts jumping out of doorways near our house. And finally, one day, we're down in the playfield where I learned to hit tennis balls, and I was with 2 older girls, and all of a sudden, Johnson shows up in a window in the East Kongyik, and he's masturbating. And I'm 9, so I don't know what that is, but the 2 other girls were like, "Oh my gosh." So we gather up, the 3 of us, and we go to Canton Alley, right behind the Winglet Asian Museum, Canton Alley number 2. And Mrs. Chin, who is my mom's era and was born in America, she calls the police. Okay, I'm 9 years old, and I have this fear of police, an unexplainable fear. I don't know why I'm afraid of them, but my grandmother taught me that. And then Mrs. Chin calls them, and I'm thinking, what is she doing? And the police drive up down Canton Alley, park in front of Canton Alley number 2, and she has her 2 daughters and myself come out and tell the police what we saw. So we tell the police what we saw, and we're explaining he's a white man, he has blue eyes, short white hair, and one of the policemen look up and go, "Is that him?" And sure enough, he's leaning out the window, looking down. So the police go take off after him, and Mrs. Chin takes the 3 of us, back into her space, and we're watching from behind the curtains, and the police bring a handcuffed Johnson and put him in the police car and take him away. So that was my first experience with realizing, oh, like Grandma has a way of doing things, and so anytime I was with Grandma, I would take on the patterns that she did, and I would say, "Lokicha," I knew what the gig was when we saw police. But then I also knew from my experience with Mrs. Chin that we were able to put Johnson actually in jail. We had to go to court and everything else, and never came back to Chinatown. Now, when we talk about outside the community, that's how Ao Shi operated. Very aware of the surroundings always. When we talked about, though, the village of women that would come to 507, all year round there would be this path of widows that would come and visit. I learned from them to respect elders. How she taught me as a little granddaughter to serve tea, serve coffee, serve biscuits, get the stool for their feet when they were tired. And the other thing that I learned from her also is, I had mentioned in the 507 video that she read letters to the women who couldn't read. So I knew I wanted to go to school. I wanted to learn how to read because I wanted to be able to provide that kind of service. So the last piece of being otherized, I went to a panel discussion a couple weeks ago. It was the launch of a documentary that will be coming out on PBS in 2018 about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And I got to hear a panel speak. There was a woman, Professor Erica Lee, who is a director of immigration history for the University of Minnesota. And she used the same word, other. And it was interesting. She didn't use the moral community piece, but it was similar to what Professor Hart was saying. And what was interesting to me is she said, after a while, the otherized community as they exist in America, they start to blend in to the moral community. So there's this gradual inclusion. And then what is interesting is, after that gradual inclusion, as the otherized individuals are in the moral community, sometimes they have to act like they're oppressors to stay in the moral community. So I started thinking about this a little bit because I learned from my father this lesson, that the government can take everything away from you in a snap. And he didn't do it as a scary thing. It's when I was in 5th grade at Bailey Gatchard Elementary. He had also been 5th grade at Bailey Gatchard Elementary in 1942. And in 1942, after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt gave Executive Order 9066, which was the internment of the Japanese. So my dad tells me this story when I was in 5th grade, and he only told it one other time. It was a month before he died, and for me that meant it was one of those significant memories that stayed with him. He talked about that morning putting on his I am Chinese button, and I think that's interesting because it's his way of saying, or it was the Chinese community way of saying, I'm not that other, you know, I'm Chinese, so don't take me away. But he went down and he waved goodbye to his buddies. He said there was a lot of buzz, nobody really talked about it, but his buddies who'd been born in America, like he was, and were Japanese, were on the buses, tags, armed guards getting them on the bus, and he said it was weird because we're waving like, yeah, we'll see you again, but nobody knew where they were going or how long they would be gone. So Dad talked about making that same trek up the street to go to Bailey Gatchard Elementary, and it wasn't real to him until he went into the classroom. And there's this picture from the Museum of History and Industry of Bailey Gatchard Elementary, a class. Dad said half the desks were empty. And that's when it became real. So that'd be like this class, our class. You know, next week we come back and half the desks are empty. And what was hard about this for me was that the government can take everything away in a snap. It's just something that kind of loomed out there. But he said when the friends came back, he never built those relationships again because it was too hard. Too much had happened for them and too much had happened for the folks here who were going on about their lives. And that is something that I think is the reason why he brought it up later on in his life. So I want to explain something about my dad, because you saw a clip of him in the previous video. His name was Pudgy, and he was proud to be Pudgy in name, body, spirit. He was not a negative person at all. So he didn't tell me that story, you know, be careful, be scared. It was really sort of this sort of practical matter that's what happened to him when he was 11 years old, that the government took everything away from these people. And you see this. So my dad had these sculptures of happy Buddhas around our house, to the point that my cousins who lived in California, when they came to visit, they actually thought, they were 8 and 9 at the time, oh, it's Uncle Pudge. They're like, no, that's not, it's a happy Buddha. And the thing is, we're not Buddhists. just had these statues because he loved the happy about it, you know. He wanted to have that there. And for me, both my parents were born in America, and they managed that gradual inclusion. So my dad worked for the very federal government for a lifetime, the post office, that he had said could take everything away. And I found that that's an interesting concept. He eventually worked all the way up to management at the post office. And my mom graduated from the University of Washington in the early 1960s and got her degree in medical technology and works in research labs. And you can see she's so happy in a lab. That's like this. So gradual inclusion for me was the American dream. And I put these logos up. These are some of the companies I worked for. So I was in high tech. Back in 1993, I didn't have to take a coding test, but eventually I did. I actually did some coding for Arthur Andersen before they became Accenture. So I understand what you're talking about. It's important for, as I parse this out, when I've grown up, I have always had this sense that I don't fit in everywhere, but I feel like I belong everywhere. And I worked really hard to prove that I belonged in these companies. And that's the great thing about America for me, is that opportunity. So when I was about 30, Randy and I were living in California, and Microsoft offered me a position back here in Seattle. And I thought, oh, this is great. We're going to go back to Seattle. We're going to go back home. So we moved back to Seattle, and I wanted to get some shoes fixed. So I gather a bag of shoes together, and I go back to the Ave, University Ave, because that was what I was used to, my old stomping ground. And I'm walking down the Ave to get my shoes fixed at the cobbler, and I see in the distance two very large white men with shaved heads and swastikas on their coats. And I go through that mental thinking that she taught me, should I cross the street, go around? And I thought, nah, you know, I can speed up my pace a little, it'll be all right. So I speed up my pace a little, and the way that they're coming at me, I thought, I need to get into the cobbler's store. But I didn't make it. And the next thing I know, I have a forearm against my chest, and I'm pushed up against the glass of the cobbler's store. And this man is yelling profanities. And he is red in the face. And I am feeling the heat and the sweat and the spray from his voice. And what I remember is him saying, "Go back to Hong Kong, you chink." And at that point, I just went to dead weight, because there was nothing else I could do. I was trapped. So they stomp off, because they had had their fun. And I gather up my shoes together in my bag, and I go to the cobbler's door, and I go to open it, and it's locked. And I pound on the door, and the cobbler's behind the counter, and he doesn't look up. I don't know why he didn't come and unlock the door. It's possible he didn't hear me. It's possible maybe he was scared too. It's possible he wanted me to go back to Hong Kong too. I don't know. But that stuck with me. This idea that, I am an other. Like, I had worked my way up in these companies and was living that American dream. And then I realized, wow, stark reminder. So fast forward 25 years. And I realized when I got Aoshi and Art Wing's Chinese Exclusion Act files that this concept of other has existed for a long time, and I started doing all kinds of research. And here we are 9 years later, and I feel like today I'm like a living experiment now with what's going on around us. Because when I did the research, I went through that idea of vilifying violence, and I talked about this in the 507 launch. And then after hearing Professor Hart, I thought, wow, you know what's consistent about this otherizing is that there was a resource need. For the Native Americans, the resource need was their land. For African American slaves, it was forced labor, free labor. For the Chinese, it was cheap labor. And all the while, Chinese are being vilified, there was violence, and then all of that is codified and cemented in the institution through legal acts. And even when it's repealed, then we still are looking at heritage, race, and ethnicity. I've learned more about these things than I ever had growing up, because what Professor Hart also said was the colonial blinders. Do you remember that? He said it makes people too uncomfortable to talk about this in public education in schools. So there's pieces of history that we don't know about. In doing my research, I started linking some pieces of history about the otherizing of Chinese and the system, and one man's career, 30-year career, of how he interacted with the system to otherize Chinese. So that's the other thing too. Otherizing, one person can't do it alone. It takes an entire system. And so, the man is Leland Stanford of Stanford University, the founder of Stanford University. In 1862, he was voted the governor of California. In his published inaugural address, he used these terms. Asia sends to our shores the dregs of her population. Degraded and distinct people are damaging, deleterious is damaging to a superior race, white. Therefore, he as governor would repress the immigration of Asiatic races. 2 years later, Mr. Stanford partners with 3 others and creates the Central Pacific Railroad Company to build the Central Pacific Railroad between 1864 and 1869. In 1869, the Chinese had done such a good job that they were heralded in the local newspaper as the Grand Army of Civilization. During that time, after 1864, in 1865, Mr. Stanford went to U.S. Congress as a part owner of the Central Pacific Railroad, and he said, the greater portion of labor employed by us are Chinese. Without them, it would be impossible to complete the western portion of this great national enterprise. So we need to bring more Chinese labor in to finish the railroad. And that's what they did, by the thousands. And this was new information to me as well. I thought the Chinese were already here for the gold rush, but it turned out that they needed more labor, so they brought them in by the thousands. Over the next 20 or so years, then, when the railroads were done, the societal vilification, violence, political rhetoric continues. The legal Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 is written. And by 1892, 10 years, it was supposed to last, Mr. Stanford now became a U.S. Senator. And he voted for the further exclusion of Chinese. So I thought that this was an important point, that individuals can play roles within that system of otherizing. And I feel like it's happening today. Muslims are being otherized. Mexico is being otherized. They're not sending you, they're sending the people that have lots of problems. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some I assume are good. It's a form of otherizing. And Charlottesville. So when that happened for me, I saw those things on television. It was like a punch in the gut. And the reason why is the story I told you about the Ave. I had put that behind me. When it happened, I remember going home and telling Randy that this thing had happened. Who could believe it, in Seattle? And have never told that story to our kids. never felt the need, because for me that was behind us. And then when I saw Charlottesville, it brought it all back. I couldn't sleep that night because I felt like the folks and the thing that had happened to me, that was 30 years ago now. These people were emboldened for that to happen again. But in the end, I am my father's daughter, and I do see the glass half full, not half empty. And I started to think, okay, what is different today that was not existent 30 years ago when I was walking down the Ave? And what I think is different today, and I see it in my kids, I see the next generation, I see all of you here in this class, you know, participating, you're interested in what people are saying about immigration. I believe that if the same situation had happened today, I believe that the cobbler would open the door. And that's something that I wanted to say to all of you, because I am committed myself. When things like this happen for others, I am trying to open the door. And it's important to me because, just as I mentioned, Professor Erica Lee said, when you become a part of that gradual inclusion, that sometimes you have to act like the oppressor. Well, some ways, my parents encouraged me not to act like the oppressor, but to not speak up. When I was growing up and I was in high school and college, they would say things like, oh, just ignore it. Let it roll off your back. Don't make waves. Don't speak up. Don't demonstrate. You can't talk about this. And in a way, that's colluding with the moral community, right? It's letting those things happen. And so I'm committing that I can't let those things happen, and that's why I'm so honored that I can come and talk with you, and I'm going to keep trying to do this. And I would encourage all of us to try to be an ally and get involved in including otherized into the community and not repeating otherizing. I'm going to do that myself. And if any of you ever find yourself a victim of being otherized, I would encourage you to tell somebody that you trust without shame, without fear, because this is something I didn't know how to do. When those things happened to me when I was growing up, I felt like somehow it was my fault. So being able to talk about it is important. And otherizing is not just race. Otherizing cuts so many different ways. If you're a witness to otherizing, try to invite that person into your community, if you can. Ask them for a cup of coffee. Ask them if they want to chat. And this one, Randy and I have been trying. If you have friends or relatives who tend toward otherizing, ask them questions. We tried this on an uncle. I asked him, have you ever felt like you were an outsider? Oh, he had stories. And then I said, so how does that apply to what's happening today? And he was able to make some bridges that he wasn't able to make before. Or even ask, this is an interesting one, ask if they knew back in 1862, you know Leland Stanford, the founder of Stanford University, when he was the governor in 1862, he talked about Asia sending the dregs of their society. Can you imagine an entire continent? You know, all of Asia? That's like all of South America sending their dregs, or all of North America sending their dregs. They're sending the dregs like they're criminals or something. And it opens up that conversation. And the last thing, and this is an opportunity, I know that the Nordic Museum is a place you can go, but the Wingluke Asian Museum, I really encourage you to visit. And if you have out-of-town family, bring your family and friends down to the museum so that they can go through the historic tour. So this is all the information. I can make these slides available if you want. They're at 719 King Street. You can use your Orca card, take the Sound Transit, get off at King Street Station, walk 3 blocks, and it's right there. Have some lunch in Chinatown. There's a great coffee shop on the corner of 6th and King. And it's amazing French bakery. If you need any contact information, Dawn is the person who got us in touch. And first Thursdays are open later, so you can look at the website. And then you please also just email me any questions, any comments. If anything comes up, I would love to chat with you. Thank you.